Right now, we've got an estimated 40,000 indigenous children currently in the child welfare system. Yeah, that's not a typo, 40,000. And the nation's tied itself into knots, trying to apologize and compensate indigenous people for the 150,000 children who attended residential schools over the course of a century. But think of that, we got 40,000 still in care right now. Now, since the 1990s, the attempted solution to every indigenous issue is, of course, to pour more tax dollars into the system and hand money directly to chiefs and councils in the spirit of self-government. So far, that strategy's led to mass corruption, housing and water shortages, unemployment, poverty, people dying at younger ages. They're suffering from crime rates that make inner city levels look like peaceful and safe by comparison. And not only that, but the people in the reserves have become so socially and economically messed up that 40,000 of their children are now wards of the state. So what's the solution the government's proposing? Well, guess what? They wanted to give $47.8 billion to the indigenous people for child welfare programs in the reserves. This is after the government already gave indigenous people $23.3 billion just the other year to compensate them for having taken children into care in the past. Now, when you break all that down, it comes up to about $1.77 million for each and every indigenous child in government care right now. Of course, these funds were to be managed by indigenous reserves themselves, as they were supposed to take over the child welfare programs. What could possibly go wrong? Well, indigenous chiefs from Canada across the country gathered in Calgary. We paid for that, of course, and sat around in the navel gaze to discuss what they're going to do with this latest waterfall of funds being offered to ease their social ills. They determined that the offer of nearly $1.8 million per child wasn't enough, and they rejected the offer. Yeah, they rejected it. Will it ever be enough? No, it won't. Decades of tossing funds at indigenous reserves while never holding them accountable for the funds being spent has led to a class of entitled chiefs and advocates who have no concept of personal accountability and can't look at solving any problems beyond holding their hands out for more funds. They're never going to be satisfied, and they're never going to solve a problem. The problem is the racial apartheid system of reserves. We could increase funding to these reserves 1,000-fold. They'd still be enclaves of socioeconomic misery. There's no situation where we can separate a race of people, put them in isolated places, make them 100% dependent upon welfare, and have it work out for the residents of these places. Yet we keep trying. Much of the reason the residential schools were created over a century ago is because children were suffering horrifically on the reserves. A race and culture that had been living as nomadic Neolithic people only a couple generations before were suddenly crammed into reserves and expected to adapt to the modern living standards of the day. It was a disaster. And some people felt educating the children, through residential schools could bring them up to the proper health and help them integrate into modern society. Now, that didn't work out really well. We know that. But part of the reason was as soon as these kids graduated from residential schools, they went right back to the reserves. Well, what did you expect to happen? During what was called the 60s scoop, yes, this is a big one, 20,000 indigenous children were taken into government care. It wasn't as if the government really wanted to take over the care of these children. They had to. The kids were malnourished and subject to abuse as reserve living had made life so dysfunctional parents couldn't raise their children any longer. The separation from their families was surely traumatic, but if they had remained in those households, they didn't face a very good future either. Ironically, if the government had left the children in those conditions, we'd be sued and blamed for neglect and having left them with their parents to be abused. Instead, the government took on the abuse and they're more effective at it. Look, indigenous leaders won't be satisfied no matter what we do. The common denominator in this whole affair over a century, though, is the reserve system itself. It's the elephant in the room that no politician has the balls to address. The reserve system's doomed to failure, and we haven't even begun discussing how to ease people out of it, much less start acting on it. How bad does it have to get? Are 40,000 kids in care not enough? The willful blindness to the root of the problem has led to proposed solutions which only exacerbate it. How could somebody look at this mess and think that moving more kids back onto the reserves while handing more money to chiefs and councils is going to make it any better? How many times you got to fail and keep trying that, guys? We're working to put kids back into the very situation that put them in the mess in the first place, and it's only going to get worse. We're never going to solve problems created by race-based policy through implementing even more race-based policy, but we keep trying. Either way, right now, the taxpayers are paying it, but the kids in the reserves are the ones paying the highest price right now. We got to get realistic with this, and when you can see chiefs turning down money like that, it's never enough, and it won't be.